Hi, everyone. We are gathered here today to discuss the 2014 drama Selma, directed by Ava DuVernay. And I was thinking that the first thing that we could do today is just sort of introduce ourselves so that anyone who happens to watch this, even though I bet this is irrelevant now that I'm looking at everyone's name. But if you could go around and introduce yourselves, I think that'd be great. I'll start. I'm Trelania.
I'm Shoshana.
I'm Marissa.
I'm Beth.
I'm Lucy.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to go about that. I've been thinking about different ways to switch up the way that these discussions go, just to kind of keep up, to frame them well for the discussion and to just keep them interesting. So I thought that I would start in just disclosing to you guys what I was thinking when I added this to the list of topics. And so, back in however many, what feels like years, but months ago when we put together this list, I knew that we would be continuing to do these discussions when we got around to Martin Luther King Day, right? And so I definitely had my mind on certain elements around that, because I knew that I wanted whatever discussion that occurred, around this time of the year to be relevant for the week that MLK Day occurs, right? And so in thinking about like a title that would be appropriate for that, I wanted to choose something that touched on parts of his life and something that directly engages with the work that he became known for. Because I think that that's super important when we think about MLK Day, because I think that one of the things that happens, one of the things that I've seen organizations do sometimes is they're like, oh, Martin Luther King Day, that Black guy, is this the first day of Black History Month? And I was like, we will not be doing that here at AADL. And so when we have this discussion that I know is going to fall in that same week, like I want to make sure that the title is like directly relevant to his life and times. So that's sort of where this selection came from. And then I guess that the next thing that I wanted to do is ask this question. Right now in this moment, what is this movie in conversation with for you? So what I mean by that is like, what else are you taking in, thinking about, reading, discussing, that was on your mind as you viewed this film, or as you thought about entering a discussion about the film? As an example, I'll give an example just to be super clear about what I was thinking about with this question. But for me, I recently read The Souls of Black Folk, and there were certain things that occurred in this movie that made me think about that, particularly the music that we heard in the movie, just because in The Souls of Black Folk, each chapter is opened with music. Like you can see like the notation of certain songs, and it really made me think about like the role of music in the Black experience, and particularly in the activism experience. Eloquent Rage, by Cooper, is some of the things that she talked about in her book, was on my mind as I was thinking about this film. And if the conversation goes that way, we might get into that a little bit more. And currently I'm reading Incidents in the Life of Frederick Douglass. There's a public discussion on that tomorrow. And then just in thinking about some of the brutality that was depicted in this film, in contrast with the brutality that he describes in that narrative, was on my mind. Additionally, for a project that I'm hoping the library is going to be able to put together for Martin Luther King Day, I was doing a very close reading of his speech, Where Do We Go From Here? So of course, having read that speech really on a sentence by sentence level and thinking about visual presentation of it, that was on my mind. And then finally, political podcasts and other coverage of the attack on the Capitol was on my mind. And finally, Black Twitter, because every time something terrible happens, I like to go there and read other people's reactions, other Black people's reactions, and other see what other Black people are thinking about and reading and things like that, because in my daily life stuck in my house, I don't get that these days. So I'm curious, what is this movie in conversation with for you guys?
Well, I would say I watched this a while ago, and then I just rewatched it in the past couple days. And in between that, I had watched King in the Wilderness. And it was really interesting having seen Selma without seeing King in the Wilderness, and then seeing it again and really seeing how there were parts of his personality that I learned about in King in the Wilderness, in that documentary, that I could see coming up even very subtly in this movie. I've also been reading a collection of essays. It's edited by Rochelle Riley, who used to write for the Free Press. It's called The Burden, and it's African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery. So it's a lot of writers I've never heard of, but it's interesting to see what parts of their lives or history they choose to underline there. And I was very much thinking about some of what I'd read there when I was rewatching this movie.
Thank you.
I guess I was thinking about, the song that Common released in conjunction with this film. And if you watch the trailer has very contemporary music, whereas in the film it's more sort of that time period, I guess. And so it had me thinking a little bit about, like, part of the reason that Hamilton really struck a chord, that at least a lot of the actors were talking about, was because it was using like contemporary language in terms of rap and hip hop and that sort of thing. And so just thinking about like how we present information, like I've read a couple of reviews about the movie, and then it was interesting saying like this looks at MLK as an organizer versus like what he is like as a preacher, what he was like as a parent, those sorts of things. And I thought, oh right, like every film looks at an angle, and I thought it was neat to sort of think of it in that context. And I also was sort of looking at it from the lens of, this is a woman of color director. How does that look different than other films in general, since they're very often directed by white men? So those are kind of the ways that I was looking at the film. And then, yeah, Lucy had the same sort of experience of I'd seen it before, and then I watched it again, but I also happened to be watching clips the day of the attack on the Capitol. And so watching these just juxtaposition was jarring in many ways.
And just like, I'm trying to make sure I'm leaving space for people to respond, but I'm not like, this isn't a classroom where it's like, all right, let me see, are you going to answer each question? So like, if there's something where you're like, I don't have anything to say on this one, just let me know, so that so I'm not just like making you feel weird.
I couldn't help but think about what happened on the Capitol, and that was kind of, unfortunately, really clouded. I mean, it was all I could think about. I watched it yesterday. I'd seen Selma years ago too, but watching it yesterday was like, it's just appalling. And yeah, we have a long way to go. But there was also the kind of joy knowing what happened to John Lewis, as he was depicted as a young man, and then knowing the future. Some of the things, Andrew Young, some things we've moved along on, but last week just was ugly, and I can't not juxtapose the two.
See, I think that one of the things that's interesting about like this moment, right, where this terrible thing has happened and it's like very front of mind. I think that there's a lesson in that for us though, right? Because like we are always responding to media, whether you mean like news media or other media, you're always responding to it within the context of everything else that you're taking in, right? So like if you're taking in subtle, light propaganda on a daily basis, for example, that's like advancing stereotypes about Black people, right? Like you are then reading news stories within the context of like these other things that you've read, right? But usually when we're engaging in a film, you're not thinking about the fact that you're reading it within the context of every single other thing that you're taking in. And I think that one of the lessons of this experience now is that we are constantly doing that. You know what I mean? Or like if something happens to, that's why jury selection is the way it is in some ways, right? Like, have you had an experience with someone who has experienced a thing that this person is being accused of? Because like they know that you cannot not know the things that you've been exposed to. And I think that like that's one of my takeaways here, right? In this larger moment, like when you're responding to something, what else are you responding to when you actually believe that you're having like a measured like thought about something? Like you may be doing that as well, and if you think you're doing that, you're probably doing that, right? But you are also responding to everything else. And I don't want to, that's something that I feel like I don't want to lose sight of, however long from now, when these events have receded a bit into the rear view. I think it, so I just think it's something to sit with, I guess. Return to my piece of paper. Unless Marissa cutting you off, or did you want to?
I've been reading People's History of the U.S. by Howard Zinn, rereading it, and I'm still way farther ago than Dr. King. But yeah, I was also thinking of it then also with King in the Wilderness, and just trying to reflect on what I learned about Dr. King in school, and thinking, because I read how a People's History of the U.S. in high school and other things, and like we learned about Dr. King, but just it's been floating in my brain of like, what did I learn about him then versus how these portrayals of him are now that I'm consuming, and just that's some of the stuff that's been percolating.
That's a really good you make me want to explore that a little bit. Like, what do you guys remember learning about Dr. King as like young people?
Not a lot. I remember learning about the bridge crossing and like marches and all these things, and then they won. Like I didn't even know really that there were multiple crossings, that it was such a process. So much of him working with other people and really strategizing, and all of the other organizing that went into this. I don't remember learning really any of that. Really anything about like Malcolm X or anything else like that. Like it was very friendly, happy, doesn't matter the color of your skin, we're all people, and that's kind of where it ended, as far as I recall. That doesn't mean it wasn't mentioned and it was, over my head as a kid, but.
Yeah, I think that it was very much like, here's a textbook, here's a lesson. And what I find interesting is now, because there are so many points of information consumption, like I don't know what it's like as a kid, but I imagine that you hear things in different ways. And so it was like, what's on the news and what's in classroom and all of this other information. And so I appreciated that the movie kind of pointed out that, like, there were organizations that had the same mission, wanted to go about it a different way. And like people were not, it wasn't like good and bad. It was, we want to do it this way. We want to do it that way. How are we working together? There's tension. And the people who we hold up as having done really great things are not perfect. They didn't know what to do. They were uncertain at moments. And I thought that's something that I think about now, that I wonder if our imperfections are more obvious and create a whole picture, as opposed to like in a textbook, here is 4 sentences about this person and we are done.
Yeah, I agree with like the fact that I think when you learn history, or when I learned it in school, that there's not much humanizing of the people that you're learning about. And so I think more it's like, what did I not learn? Which is kind of what you were saying, Marissa. And it's like, this movie shows you, I think, parts of Dr. King's humor, and the fact that he was doubtful, and the fact that he was tired, and that he did need the help of other people. I mean, I think that those things wouldn't be bad to learn about in history. It wouldn't hurt to learn that this is a human person who, like you were saying, Trishana, isn't perfect, but still did these things.
Yeah, it seems, unless you were writing a report, on him as a kid, that there just isn't, the way our textbooks are, that there isn't a lot of room for that stuff until you get older, seems like. I do want to just share, I remember when Dr. King was killed, but I remember because I was in first grade. I remember my mother crying, and I was kind of new at the school, but I thought he was a king. That's one of the memories I have. But just how upset, people were was a big thing. It was a lot to absorb, as a kiddo.
Also, I think realizing how young he was, I think it's Dr. King takes up so much space in my historic knowledge of the civil rights movement, and being like, how old were you? Like, how much did you manage to do in a short lifespan?
Truly.
Thank you for sharing those stories. So you guys kind of touched upon this, but I'm curious about how you experience the following in the movie. So I feel like this movie talked about the structure of different elements of the modern civil rights movement, right? Because we saw a lot of different people who were working on different pieces, but I think that the mirror to that also in this movie that is illuminated is the structure of the resistance to that movement. So I'm wondering how you guys experienced that, or if you're like, what are you talking about? That's a fine response to that question too.
I was just disgust, really. I mean, just with the wiretapping and the vilifying. Yeah. I guess I'm just not in a very good place right now, but I mean, it was a good film, but yeah.
I was hearing something, I think when at more of the height of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations during the summer, I heard an interview, and they were talking about how, like, there was the nonviolence movement, and did it work? And should we continue to stick to nonviolence, or is there a place for destruction of property and that sort of thing? And it was interesting to see in this, like, even in that time period, there was argument of, is nonviolence the ultimate way to do this? And so, but to also see how much resistance and fear there was on behalf of white government officials about people who actively said they were going to be nonviolent, like that, it made me feel like it had a lot more power than sometimes I feel like it has now. I don't know. I remember as a kid being like, why does marching do anything? It's people walking. How does that change movements? And occasionally that thought has continued to come back to me, and sort of whether or not the people in power are listening and watching that.
Interesting. See, like when I was thinking about that element, one of the things that it made me think is that it was like an intentional, I read this as an intentional like push against this notion of history that is sometimes taught within the context of the larger progress narrative, which is typically taught. But like you will hear people say like, well, this is the ideas of the time, or even suggest people did not know any better. Right. But like when you were watching this, you see that people absolutely knew better, because like you were watching the very deliberate choices that were made from root to tip along the way. Right. Like you see in this film depicted how people understood, I think, what their role in the maintenance of the system was. Like these people who were depicted. Right. Because like we saw like the FBI surveillance, as you were talking about, Beth, right? Like we saw George Wallace show up, right? He knew what he was doing. You know, he knew what he was this, like in real life, this charismatic character, right? Like he had he then had 4 wives. Like he married four, like, and that's interesting to me, because to me that says something about like his magnetism, a certain type of magnetism, right? Like he could draw people to him, he could bring people to his side, and you could see that in that conversation, in that famous conversation between Lyndon Johnson and George Wallace, where Lyndon Johnson's like, George, you're not going to sit in my office and sit here and tell me that you do not have control over these people, because I know who you are, and I understand what you could do, right? But it's like shows how people knew what they were doing. I mean, that conversation is an example of that as well, right? Like, don't tell me you don't run that state. I know you run that state, right? Or even down to the registrar, right? Like he was playing his role. He knew his role, and he knew he was not going to let that woman or anyone who she was a stand-in for past his post. These people had their posts, and you can see that, and you can see that they understood what these posts are. And I feel like this movie really, like if you're looking at it through that lens, really illuminates what systemic racism looks like, right? Because like you watch all of the different layers, and these layers, these gears work together. And you can hear it in some of the language too, like your state, your job, you didn't keep this under control, right? Because it is a sophisticated network of gears that must turn together. If they do not turn together, it doesn't work, right? Like if you can't keep it, you know, if you allow outrage to occur, it doesn't work, right? And so I thought that it was illuminated very well when you're watching like the different parts of the movement on King's side, right? Like he's talking to different people, you know, they're working their different networks, you're seeing all the alliances, and it's very difficult to not see the mirror on the other side. And I thought that was really well done. Like this may be common in film. I know nothing about film. This movie made me feel like if you knew more about film, you would be able to read this text better. But I thought that's what I was thinking about when I wrote this question, I guess.
The conversations between the president and Dr. King were really interesting and well illuminated too, and also kind of mirroring the conversation that Johnson had with George Wallace, where he's like, "It's of course you have control over this." Then you have Dr. King saying, "You won an election by more than anyone ever has, and here you are telling me like your hands are tied. I just don't see it," you know. And it is kind of that it's almost like this pawning off of responsibility too that each one of those people in that ladder has. I didn't know. I mean, those conversations, I think, like, here's this man who has the ear of the president to a point, but he's in that office, and he's kind of calling him out, you know.
Yeah, there was that moment when Johnson is talking to Wallace, and the camera's going back and forth, and there's a moment where you see Johnson, and then when it goes back to him, it's him and very much the empty seat on the couch next to him. And that was sort of the shift. I thought was like, oh, like this is where Dr. King's words like had impact. Like there's someone who's not in the room who's very much in the room in that moment. And it's just those kind of like subtle things that I'm like, good storytelling, good job, people.
What Lucy, in the conversation that you were talking about, the thing that stood out to me in that conversation was when Dr. King was like, "You are the president. I am a preacher. Like, yeah. let's talk about the power dynamics here in this room." And I appreciated that. I am wondering how you guys I guess that like the question I have before I ask this one is like, as someone who like I am not a film person, like I just said, I'm just wondering like how, like who here can I point to as the film person in the room, if we have one, because I'm so curious. Like this made me very curious about the storytelling conventions that take place in filmmaking. So is anyone that person who can I stare at across the screen?
I mean, I took some film classes, but I will also preface it by saying I've only seen this film once, so I may not have caught everything.
You're like, yeah, a little bit, but please don't put me on the spot. So, like, I guess I'm asking that question to be like hitched on to this one. I'm interested in the role of violence in this film, because I felt like the violence that occurred was definitely a character in this film, right? Like we saw this character, we heard this character discussed. This character, looked at different ways in different scenes. And I'm just curious about your thoughts and experiences with that as you viewed this film.
I don't know what, like the technique, again, I'm not a film buff either, but just the girls at the beginning, the explosion was very artfully done and like almost like ballet-esque. But to that, I had it on pause for a little bit, and because I had to go do some, but anyway, it just was, I'd seen it a couple times essentially, and it was very powerful, and um, especially with the girls being on the stairs and just talking, and then boom, they were gone. So.
Well, then we've got this movie that's talking about this movement that's known for its nonviolence, and this movie is bookended by violence, right? Because at the beginning you have the explosion, and at the end we have the part where it ends, and it's like, yep, and this guy was assassinated, right? And so like here are these bookends, these very violent bookends for this, right? And then we see the different ways that like this nonviolent movement depended on violence, right? And we see that that was a part of the discussion. Like, there was someone who was saying like, how can you call yourself nonviolent when you're coming down here and like waiting for the violence to happen for it to be on film, right? And so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah,
And that made me think about, like, I think it is that exchange that made me explicitly begin to think about the role of violence in the storytelling of the film, in addition to the representation of what occurred.
Yeah, I mean, my experience with film is all making very little like film critique education, but I think that how you choose to invoke emotions, whether it's through editing or through cinematography or dress and clothing. I mean, I think that the fact that the final march where everyone is wearing like much more casual clothes and much lighter, like gives you a different sense than when they're first walking, in very buttoned up coats. So like even costuming has very important roles in it. But I remember hearing an interview with Paul Rusesabagina, who was the guy of Hotel Rwanda, the one who sort of saved all these lives. And someone asked him, like, was it really that bad? And he said, it was way worse. Like there were stacks of bodies. And he said, but we couldn't present that to the audience in a movie and have people, they would just shut down. And so to present it in a way that brings an emotional reaction, you kind of have to figure out, like, sometimes it's not going over the top. It's much more intimate. It's much more I think that watching the violence on the bridge was much more emotional for me by hearing the journalist narrate it and that person getting choked up in the process. And, they show the black and white images on TV screens and how that was absolutely having a reaction. But it's still like a grainy image. Like to see a movie where you're having more moments of seeing someone's face have an emotional reaction to it, I think gave more weight to the violence versus just another trooper perpetuating more violence on the screen.
I was thinking of it as almost like a war film. That first scene of crossing the bridge, like compared to the first scene with the little girls, it's very bright and colorful. They're laughing and talking. It's a lot more intimate violence, it feels, because you're so close, tightly framed on the girls. And then on the bridge, there's a lot more slow motion. The tear gas made it kind of foggy, like washed out, more black and white. And then on the TVs, I mean, it just felt very, it just had a different emotion to it, instead of like the more intimate watching the girls, of watching all of the police chase them down. It felt to me more like a war, like seeing images from like a more of a battle, and then seeing people watching that on a black and white TV. It just had that different different feel. I don't know.
One thing I find really interesting is when we're watching a movie that is about history and we still hold our breath or have an emotional reaction, even though we know it's coming. You know, I think that when you see the girls like walking on the stairs, I remember going, oh no, oh wait, there's 5 of them. Oh, and then remembering, oh right, there, 4 died. But that, like, I had historical knowledge, but watching the story being told still evoked emotions more than just the history of it.
When I saw them in the church, I was like, oh no, I know what this is. And then I was watching it, understanding exactly what I was looking at, and it still made me jump, and I had to stop it. I was just like, okay. And this was my first time. Clearly, it was my first time watching this, but I was like, oh, okay, I see what we're in for. This is not going to be like a gentle little depiction of what happened. And that kind of leads me to my next question. So, you guys touched on this already in talking a little bit on how this film, this dramatization, depicts humans, not heroes, right? And so what does that do? What does that mean? How does that make us look at this film differently?
So one of the most human moments for me was the conversation between Coretta and Malcolm, where she asks him first if he loves her, and then if he loved any of the others. That's just such a human moment of recognizing that he's not this monolith hero, perfect person. And then also throughout seeing him doubt things and really thinking through things and being tired, and just that humanity, it really paints a different picture of how he made choices that he did, of like when they crossed the bridge and he prayed and then he turned back and everyone was really mad. And he was just like, I would rather you be mad at me than people to die, which I thought was really interesting at both explaining the actions and just where he was mentally, of why he did things the way he did, which I thought was even more powerful than the saint figure.
Yeah, he also has that moment where he's having a conversation. I think it's like with the assistant DA or whoever they've sent in to sort of tell him not to do the whole march. And he's saying, like, of course I want to be happy and live a long life and do all those things, but I also want other people to be happy, even if it means I'm not around to see it. And I think that, like, that spoke to me, and just that, like, it was like he was called to do this, but he's still just, he's a human being, and he doesn't, I mean, he is tired and he's worn down, but he's still going to do this because that is what he, I mean, really, you see, it's like he was called to do this. But I just think seeing that people who do heroic deeds are just people. I mean, and this movie, I think, highlighted that really well.
Yeah, I think that this is going to sound so small comparative, but he's known as this great orator, and yet I really noticed how often food shows up, you know, in terms of like, they're all piling into someone's house to like figure stuff out, but they're starting with food. And, you know, the volunteers are showing up and they're making sandwiches. And like, there's the like very basic, like behind the scenes, you know, yeah, I need to go out and lead a march that's going to be televised. I got to shave, you know, like there's those kinds of, you know, humanizing, and like it's not all great speeches. It's sometimes like, you know, pass the jam.
And so when I was thinking about this question, one of the things that I was thinking about is like, what does it do when we create these mythical figures, right? So like if you've got a Martin Luther King who is a mythical figure, I feel like at some time, I feel like in some ways what that can do is absolve us from thinking about what it is that we can do in our own lives, right? Because like if you look at this person, it's this perfect person, these unattainable goals, right? Like this chosen person, right? Then you can think like, oh, that's what those people do, right? But like when you're looking at a very human depiction, that's a different thing to look at, right? Or even if we look at a different figure, like I feel like the other thing that happens with like these heroic figures is that they turn into these empty vessels that you can pour, in some ways, empty vessels that you can pour whatever you want to pour into them. And I feel like people do that with Abraham Lincoln, right? Like I feel like the way that he's deployed all the time from all of these different points of view that are at odds with each other, which kind of show that, right? Because it's like, all right, Abraham Lincoln, president during the war, you know, oh, don't forget he was a Republican, tall hat, you know, humble beginnings. And then I feel like people just take whatever elements that they want and then like dress it in his tall hat and then like use it however they feel like, right? But like it's difficult to do that to somebody who's a full human being. Like it's difficult to do that to somebody who you know, who had doubts about marrying his wife when it was time. That's Abraham Lincoln, not Martin Luther King, you know, or like it's difficult to do that to somebody who you understand you know, struggled with depression, you know what I mean? Like so like what role is served in a version of history that like just shoots heroes out at us, ? That's one of the things that this movie made me think about or question. So I kind of want to go another question that I was thinking about, and Shoshana, what you said about like all the food being around kind of ties into this a little bit. And this also, I guess, ties back to me thinking about the book Eloquent Rage. It made this film that talks about King's life. For some reason, I found myself thinking about the roles of women in this film. And I wonder if anybody else was thinking about or even what knee-jerk responses that question might be causing.
I had two reactions specifically. One was there was absolutely a moment where I went, does this pass the Bechdel test? You know, do you have two women having a conversation together, not about a man? And there's the conversation that Coretta Scott King is having with the other
Amelia Boynton, I think.
Yeah, and it's a good conversation. I think it's the only one I could count. But the other thing was, I was thinking about, and this is going to sound kind of silly, but like these were people marching into violent situations in heels, you know, and so the role of women in this, in addition to are they behind the scenes, are they in front, like just thinking about what it means to still have to have like your woman of the time persona on when you're going to do something dangerous and you still have to carry your purse. Like that was interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I started thinking about the women when Niecy Nash's character had all of these people in her house. And she's like, oh, how many people am I? Oh my goodness, you are a large man. I do not know if I have enough biscuits for this purpose. Right. And just thinking about like that seeing that made me think about the other women that I would see in the movie. And then of course, you know, thinking about like the relationship, the marriage between Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King further was making me think about like, you know, how gender expectations played into the depiction, both the relationship itself and the depiction of that relationship. But also, you know, thinking about where we see King looking for comfort, right? Like he understands that he's taking a lot away from his family. You know what I mean? He understands that he's got responsibilities both inside and outside of his house, right? And you see him battling that, and you see him making a decision like, look, I got to be at home right now, right? Because that was the right decision for what's up. You know, there was a time where he was like, I need you right now. And I can't have that. And I made this situation essentially, right? And then we see her later appear and he's like, you're here. And she's like, I'm here, right? We see him call Mahalia Jackson to hear music, right? And so like this is another place where he has sought comfort from a woman in this film, and in that case it's just he wanted to hear her sing. And then like we see you know, in the scene that you guys were talking about, when it's like, do you love me, do you love the other women? And then he paused way too long. That was so uncomfortable. I had to stop the movie then. I was just like, I cannot with the pause here. But this movie made me think about it made me think about that in terms of the seeking of comfort, which is a way that I had not thought about that before. Like I had thought about his you know, extramarital affairs before, you know, when I had thought about it in terms of like how many men who have occupied a powerful position do you know of that you cannot say that about, right? Like these are like people who we don't know personally, but we know about their affairs, right? And so like, you know, like I've always read it within that context. But in this movie, for some reason, I read it as like, okay, this is a place where he could seek comfort. Like he couldn't go out to the bar and get drunk. You know, he couldn't escape in that way. Like there were so many things that he could not do because he had to be very mindful of his public appearance. So what is the thing that you could do that like nobody else really could see unless the FBI is spying on you, right? And then it made me further think about just the way that we construct manhood and masculinity, and like where are the places that we allow men to seek comfort, right? Like we ask, you know, in lots of situations we ask women to perform that work. So where was he to like seek comfort? And this is also a man who like lived knowing he could die at any moment. So like every single day he is like, I might die today. And so like when you're doing your calculus, I think that's definitely like a part of it. And like if you are afraid of dying every single day, and you're out and about, can we blame this man for wanting to be held at night from time to time? Question mark. Again, I've said this before in one of these discussions. I am not an adultery apologist. But this movie just framed that whole thing differently for me.
I thought it was interesting that they did intentionally mention it, that they have that conversation. So you know that there's other women, but they don't show it. And so on one hand, it's humanizing him of saying like he is a human and he is needing comfort or whatever, like it happened. But that he still is this heroic figure. And I was wondering if by showing him with another woman, like in your face cheating on Coretta, if that would have been like too much for people to have to reckon with. Whereas otherwise it's kind of like this thing that like you know about, but you don't have to directly confront. I don't know, I thought that was interesting.
It's interesting to think about.
Yeah,
I think though, if that's the way that stuff normally happens, you know what I mean? Like you don't know, I don't know. I mean, like who knows? But like, it seems like that is sort of like a more like, I don't, maybe I'm just speculating, but it doesn't seem like most people who come to find out that their partner has had an affair, it doesn't seem like it would just normally be splashed about, right?
Well, I guess because I was thinking about it from the point of view of the audience, where we're seeing
Yeah.
all these intimate things, and we know that the FBI is spying on him. So then I was thinking like, well, then it has to be with a woman that he knows wouldn't go and talk about it, or he has to know it's someone with discretion. So it has to probably be someone within his circle. And then so I'm seeing the other characters and I'm like, but who was he cheating with? And then it's like this whole other thing of like, who is it? Where is it? Like logistically, he's with people all the time. Like, when is he making time for these other women? I don't know.
One of the reviews that I read said this film really points out that we really need, like, where's the miniseries that really goes into all these other stories that are not told? You know, there's like all these other ministers that had work. There were all these other organizers. There were all these other relationships that we don't hear about because there was only so many inches on a page that they would print then. And now, like, now that you can stream anything anywhere, like, can we tell those stories? Because yeah, there's more to dig into, whether it's more of Martin Luther King's life or more of the life of, you know, the people who stood behind him on that stage.
Lucy, you looked like you were going to say something a second ago.
I think I read something very similar to that, Shoshana, where they were like, well, what about, where's the miniseries with Diane Nash and James Bevel's marriage? Or like, it does make you think about, this whole conversation making me think about all those people that were surrounding him. And like what you were saying, Marissa, also, you're looking around for the person who he was maybe having an affair with, but also like who was covering for him. He's always with people. So other people, I mean, like, when does he ever sneak away to be by himself? Like, somebody knows that somewhere. It's just, I don't know. It's just interesting to think about all the people around him all the time. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that after that, but sort of.
One of the things that I thought was interesting about the scene when they're in the room together with where King and his wife are in the room together with the tape, I thought that it was I was like, interesting choice. I was thinking about the filmmaking when we see that there is like this intimacy between King and Coretta Scott King, because she's like, I know what you sound like. You know what I mean? And that's like also, you know, I think that like when we think about somebody's indiscretions, like I think it can overshadow their primary relationship, right? And I think that here there was a deliberate choice made to like speak to, you know, them maintaining a certain intimacy, which I thought was interesting. I mean, we see that throughout the film. You know, she's there at the beginning as he's preparing to accept his award. You know, she's there throughout, and so like there's you know, there's like the you know, running of the household, the like supportive partner in all sorts of ways, but it also hints at a sexual intimacy between husband and wife that I think sometimes, you know, when you hear about the other stuff, you just like that kind of falls out of our heads, I think. And I thought it was interesting. The other thing I was thinking about when I was thinking about women in the movie are the white women that we saw in the movie. And like I think that this was a deliberate choice when, you know, a lot of the like women that we see, you know, in some of these different scenes with the marches and stuff, it really showed their role as enforcers of the status quo. Like we saw that a lot when we saw like women like watching what was happening. We saw the anger on their faces, and we heard them yelling at these activists. And I think that that's something that often gets left out of tellings of the stories, right? Because like we hear these stories of like the men, you know, like you hear like about King, and we saw George Wallace, and we saw Lyndon Johnson, we saw Rustin, and we saw all these other people, but we saw women as well performing their own support roles, right, within this movement. That's what I saw anyway. Anyone else see that? I feel like I'm like, here's what I saw, guys.
I liked the fact that there were a lot of different supporting characters that there's no way you can get into all their stories, but you know, they had a strong impact. You know, I think that like what was Johnson's advisor? Was it Lee White? He's the guy who's in the office occasionally. Like in history, like he has a lot of power, but like it's just this subtle sort of on the edge thing. And I sort of like, I think a lot of people were impacted by, you know, she never says a word, but those images of, is it Viola, the white woman who was killed by the Klan right after the Selma March? Like that has impact. And then I think some people also will realize, oh, I'm being impacted by the death of a white woman in this, even though we know King also dies. So, you know, let's realize where our emotions are designed to be triggered by our current culture.
I thought that was super. I think that that's interesting to think about, right? Because like one of the things that well, you guys know about my sick obsession with Lyndon Johnson. But one of the reasons why I never watched this movie was because people had told me when this movie came out that my president boyfriend was not depicted well in the movie. But like when you think about like what this film is, you know, and how it is telling the story of King and his like work to secure voting rights, like that's not Lyndon's story. Like that's gross. Like I'm like, we're on a first name basis, but that's not his story. You know, like he does not need to be the hero in the story, and we often do that, right? Or even like I catch myself doing that in language when even in some of these discussions, right? Like because you're primed to be like. You know, this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. But this hurts white people too, as if the fact that it hurts Black people isn't enough of a statement, right? And I think that idea is part of what she's taking on in the directing of this movie, right? And I think that you're right, that she's like letting us see that impulse, right? Like we are all conditioned to identify with white characters, you know. That's an idea that came up in one of the Baldwin movies, right? He was talking about like, you know, taking in Western movies and seeing himself as a protagonist, where you know, there are these movies where you know, the protagonists are really terrible to Indigenous people, right? Like where do you belong in that movie, right? And I think that she, like, in the directing of this movie, like really allows you to like think about that. Or even you know, like at the end of the movie when they talk about like what happened in Jim Clark's life and what happened in George Wallace's life. At the end of George Wallace's life, he acknowledged that all of the stuff that he spent a big old chunk of his life doing was wrong. Like but I think it's proper to not include that in this movie, because this is not George Wallace's redemption story, you know. And also, like, he didn't say anything that he did was wrong until after he was shot and paralyzed, right? And like, I always wonder, like, if you never got shot and if you were never like in that wheelchair, not feeling like super manly anymore, like, would you have ever come to the conclusions that you came to? ? But I think that I think that she invites us to think about like, where do we start our story? Where do we end our story? Right. Because she makes a very specific choices to anchor this very tightly, right? Like she's making sure that we know that, you know, we know that this is after the bus boycott. Like, even if you don't, I feel like a lot of us, or maybe I'm just speaking about the way that I learn things. Like I'm not a memorizer. I'm like, if I need to know a date or a time, it'll become, my brain will tell me that. Like you will see it enough times that you remember it, right? But like, even if you're not like that person who puts a timeline, you know that certain things happen. You know that the bus boycott happened. You know that those girls were killed at the 16th Street Baptist Church. You know that Malcolm X was assassinated. You know that certain things happen. And she makes sure that we know where we are in this film. You know what I mean? She makes sure that we know that like while this was happening, Malcolm X was assassinated. You know, she makes sure that we know like, okay, this is after those girls were murdered at that church. This was before this other thing happened. You know, she kind of makes you know that a lot was going on at that time, right?
Can I ask a question? So with that, like one of the things, because right, I was like, oh God, how much history do I not know while watching this, in terms of dates and times and that sort of thing. But I know that they didn't get permission to use King's actual speeches. And so on one hand, that is unfortunate. On the other hand, it frees you up to make sure that he says the lines that you need said to move the story along. But I'm curious what people felt about, you know, hearing him depicted with words that weren't his famous words.
See, I don't think that I think that most of us maybe it depends on like how old you are and like what you've been exposed to, but I think that most of us only ever experience him in snippets anyway. So I don't think it much matters. You know, like you know, like a different catchphrases, but you don't know. I don't know what speech they came from. I don't know in what context he said them, because we experience him in snippets.
Yeah, actually hearing you say that too, Sherlyn, it makes me think about like if we can't hear his most famous words in this movie, if she can't rely on those little sound bites, then we're almost getting like more of his character in a way, because new dialogue has to be created that still gets across the message that he wanted to get across. So yeah, it didn't seem jarring or strange to me. I don't know. It would have been a different movie, I think, if she could have used pieces of his actual speeches.
I think so. What did you guys find yourselves thinking about male ego in this movie?
Always. Yeah, there's a lot of male posturing. I mean, there's posturing and posturing for power and having folks do things their way.
And then it was everywhere. It wasn't just like King versus president. It was also like the two organizers of SNCC, and between Malcolm X and Dr. King, like it was between all of the major male characters. Yeah.
Was quite fascinating to see back to back to back to back to back to back to back like that. And I wonder, and I wonder what like having this film not be directed by a man, I wonder if we saw that, like, I wonder if that put that male ego business in greater relief. Because I did not go into the movie thinking that I was gonna look at that. But then like when I saw it, and then I saw it again, and then I saw it again, and then I saw it again, I was like, huh, like this feels like an observation of male ego from the outside to me. I was just wondering what you guys.
Because it also like even the part with Niecy Nash in the kitchen, like even having that moment acknowledged, she's like, oh, there's a lot of you here that I have to cook for. And then all the male ego, it definitely felt like a woman directed it. Like it felt like it in a good way.
So what were you guys hoping that we would talk about that we didn't get to? One of my favorite questions.
Something I had been thinking about was kind of about your question with violence as a character, and how it was used as a tool specifically to show like they're using violence, seeing violence and showing it to everyone, holding up that mirror and saying like, this is racism, this is police brutality, like this is happening in order to create change. And then I'm thinking about how that's been reflected today, whereas it is still happening, the physical violence, but it's also sort of allowed for a more insidious white supremacy, where it's like, I'm not racist because I would never beat someone in the street, but it still perpetuates systems of oppression in different ways and in quieter ways. I mean, maybe now also the world is as it is, it's kind of more vocal again, but for so long it was very, it was quieter, a quieter racism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, people weren't as proud of it, you know. I mean, just thinking back when Obama was president, and because I've tried to understand, like, of the folks that I know that have been Trump supporters, just were they always like this, and they just decided they never wanted to be vocal because they didn't want to look a certain way with a Black president. But then all bets were off when you know who started his business. Anyway.
Yeah, I saw, I guess at the end, I was almost waiting for juxtapositions of current imagery. And I realized that they do that in Black Klansman, where at the end, they start cutting in current scenes that are not so different. But it was pretty easy to do that in my own mind in terms of, on the more positive side, like the image of John Lewis and the Obamas walking across the bridge, you know, in sort of anniversary acknowledgement moment, like that was very prevalent in my head while I was watching the end of the film. But it's an interesting choice in terms of, I always think that there's a lot of films that are made because we want action, but the filmmaker stops short of saying, now go do X. And I don't necessarily know if there was a demand for action in the making of this story. But then you start to, like, the way the film was then used as an education tool and how, like, I think that was interesting in terms of where do you decide to stop telling the story?
I thought it was interesting, like you guys made me think about, I thought it was interesting how we saw that, that he always saw that, like, he was like working on one small slice of a pie, right? But also that the other side saw that too. It's like they never stop, like in the Johnson Wallace thing, it's like they never stop, you know. First they're going to want this, then they're going to want this, then they're going to want this, then they're going to want this, but then he like hops and says like, and then they're going to want like free stuff, all like, you know, then it like skips the track and then goes like directly to communism, like in the same way that currently, like we see the same thing. It's like they want this, and then it skips the track, and then it's like talking about like straight up socialism. So I thought that was interesting, but I also thought it was interesting the way that we saw in one of the scenes where we're seeing Dr. King struggle when he's like, you know, we look to be able to sit at the lunch counter, but what does it matter if you can't afford to buy anything there, or if you can't read the menu because there's no school to teach you how to read, right? Like, and so we see in the middle of the film, right, that like one issue is tied to the other, but then there's always more work that needs to be done. And so I thought that like the telling of the story, that again, like we were talking about before, like anchors it in time and shows that a bunch of stuff was happening before and that stuff happened after. And then we see that like reinforced when it's like there's so many issues that are tied together. Or even when he's talking about like we need voting rights now because you know, if we don't have voting rights, we can't elect different people, which means that there's no difference in the day-to-day life, right? And so like this film shows you in multiple ways how it's all tied together, right? And so like in that point, I do think that the entire film as a piece, no matter where it ends, suggests, right? Like, oh, this isn't the end. Like we saw at the beginning that it wasn't the end, and we saw in the middle that it wasn't the end, and we saw at the end that it wasn't the end. This is not a film, I think, that like that tries to that this is not a like, and now we have reached the end. We have overcome. Like we don't see that at all. The only person who uses that language in this film is Lyndon. Again, my gross use of his first name is really sick. But like but it's not his story, and like he saw the whole thing a different way, right? Like when we look at like how he saw it for real, he you know, he was like, I cannot even believe that I am being pushed more, you know, because from his point of view, born in 1908 in like the middle of Texas, you know, he is somebody who like betrayed his southern roots, you know, and you know, was very much thinking about like what his legacy was going to be. And he understood that like he was going to go back home to the LBJ ranch, and they're going to be people who he otherwise could have had like the relationships that you have if you follow the social order. And he didn't do that, right? He knew what he was giving away. And he was like, and this man is asking me for more? How dare you? Right? Because like his point of view was just this different thing. But again, it's not his story. But I think that this movie successfully argues like, oh, there's always going to be work to be done. And like, here's one piece of it. And if you want to know more about more pieces, visit any of the many figures that we introduce you to here in this film, right? Like she gives us a lot of places to do more learning, I think. So I'm going to use that as a way to see how I corralled us to my like wind up question. What does this make you want to learn more about? Or what are you reading next that has to do with anything that we talked about today?
I want to learn more about Amelia Boynton, I think her name was, specifically, who was I mean, she's had she had an important role in this, but I just think I looked her up a little bit, and she led a long life after this moment in Selma. And so it's kind of like what you were just saying, but taking that cue of like, okay, we've introduced each of these characters, these people. Here's your jumping off point. That was just one person who interested me to know more about what she went on to do.
I want to see King in the Wilderness. Is that just, can you stream that, or is it on HBO?
I saw it on YouTube, to tell
on
you
YouTube.
the honest truth.
Okay. Good to know.
I think the role of journalism in this, in this moment in history, and then this current moment of history, I mean, that's always something I've been paying attention to. But one thing I was thinking about is that, you know, I believe he's portraying a New York Times reporter, the one who is, you know, verbalizing over the phone what he's seeing. And I'm hearing more and more reports from journalists of what it was like to cover the riots and the insurrection at the Capitol, and kind of stopping a moment and going, I want to pay a little bit more attention to the background of the journalists. I mean, if he was a white journalist, because probably there weren't a lot of Black writers for the New York Times at that time, but how does that change the way we tell the story in the press? And I can only imagine what that experience would have been like in the Capitol if you were a member of the media and a person of color. Like, so just trying to pay more attention to who's telling the story as it's reported in the news, I think is interesting.
I don't have a specific thing I'm going to read next, but some other history stuff, filling in the gaps of then to now. So we talk about the work doesn't end, and a lot going on now, and just keep going.
For me, this one made me want to think and learn more about the role of the church in the civil rights movement. Like I personally am not like a religious person. Like I didn't grow up in the church, anything like that. But you know, I've known that like the church has had like a role, and this film made me want to learn more about that. Like particularly when we see injured people being taken back to churches, and it just makes me want to learn about that role, like what was happening there in terms of that work. And I'm sure somebody's written I'm sure like this is kind of thing, I'm sure we have a book about that, you know, that I could just listen to probably, or I bet that like there's some podcast where somebody like took a deep dive, so I'm hoping to learn more about that. All right. Thank you guys all for such a discussion. You guys all brought something different to it. I always feel like I learn so much and get like new things to think about from these conversations. I'm always grateful for people participating in them. So thank you guys. And I guess I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there, and only take in the amount of news that is healthy for you. That is what I hope for all of you guys right now.